So without further ado, I'll make a start. So I said my name is Will. I am an urban and economic geographer by training, really interested in the ways in which people make a living in rapidly urbanizing places around the world, and particularly the ways in which people's changing livelihoods in rapidly urbanizing cities, rapidly growing cities, is changing the ways in which we think about economy, the ways in which we think about environment, and the ways in which we think about infrastructure. So I'm going to tell you in a moment a little bit of the work that I've been doing in Kampala in Uganda over the past 10 years, which will be an extract from a lecture that I give on urban African economies, which is part of the geography, human geography and global development courses here at Queen Mary. So please use the questions if you have any. We'll also use a couple of polls in a moment. So if you keep an eye on the sidebar, we can keep in touch and collaborate using that particular technology. So at some point between 2007 and 2009, a young man in Uganda arrived into central Kampala on the back of a boda boda motorcycle. A young woman in Mumbai in India took a shared taxi ride into the center of the city. A man in northeast Brazil boarded a bus headed to the city of Rio de Janeiro. Or somebody in a neighboring city or in a neighboring country took a similar journey, most likely on the African or Asian continents, and for the first time in history, the majority of the world's population became urban. That is to say, the majority of the population in the world resided in cities. This is seen as a transformational moment in human history and in the social sciences, setting off a process of urbanization that's set to continue to accelerate over the next 50 years, to the extent that by 2050, over 6 billion people, that is 2/3 of the planet, will be living in towns and cities, bringing diverse groups of people, goods, and institutions into closer and closer contact with one another. So why is this interesting? Why is this deserving of our time and our study as geographers, as development scholars, as environmental scientists? I think it's exciting for at least 3 reasons. This is why I'm interested in it. So firstly, rapid urbanization is interesting economically. As the population densities increase, demand is created for new goods, new services, new infrastructures for people with divergent needs and resources, right? And people who need to create a living and make a living in different ways. Secondly, it's really interesting socially and spatially, insofar as these kind of new material and economic exchanges create new social relations and new spaces in the city. And I'm going to be talking about one of those particular spaces in a moment, the urban marketplace. Thirdly, it's important environmentally, insofar as urbanization brings both new pressures on environmental and ecological systems, while also presenting new solutions for living together in high density. And yet, at the same time, and particularly in the context in which I look at this particular issue, so in East Africa, some of the narratives that shape our understanding of rapid urbanization are so often tipped towards the negative, right? So we see titles like "Africa's booming cities are running out of water." Post-COVID, there's an emphasis on kind of this rapid urbanization as being the kind of epicenter for epidemics, and particularly the kind of rises in young people being described as a youthquake, right, which puts pressures on kind of existing infrastructural systems, raises questions about work and employment and social problems, right? And so researchers such as myself have looked at this, and particularly on the African continent, and argued that something interesting is going on here. Right, so this kind of emphasis on the negative is not accidental. It's part of a kind of broader historical trajectory to, in Mbembe's words, describe everything that African states, societies, and cities are not, and very little about what they are. As James Ferguson argues, when we hear about Africa today and African cities, it's usually in urgent and troubled tones. It's never just Africa, but the crisis in Africa, the problems of Africa, the failure of Africa, the moral challenge of Africa. And equally, I start my Urban Africa course by thinking about all the ways in which popular imaginations, indeed, of the African continent are often rural imaginations of a village, of a church, of a kind of agricultural setting, right? So in a sense, the African city, which is in many sense the city of the future, has for a long time been kind of missing in our imaginations of what rapid urbanization looks like today and is going to look like in the future. And so the starting point for a lot of my research is kind of trying to understand why that is, and trying to do research in a way that kind of brings back an emphasis on African cities as African urbanization back into the fold, back into the center of social science in ways that help us understand what's going on, not only in places like Kampala, where I work, but also thinking back to cities like London. So at this point, it'd be good to kind of check in and think collectively about the places we're coming from and the ways in which we're thinking about process of urbanization. So we've got a couple of quick polls. And this is not a test because depending on how you measure urbanization, depending over what period you measure it in, depending on even on how you define the boundaries of a city, right, which is something else we'll talk about in class, you get slightly different answers to this question. But I'm now going to publish this poll. And so in the sidebar, you should be able to answer this poll and give your response. So which of the following cities do you think currently has the highest rate of population growth? Is it London? Is it New York? Is it Tokyo? Is it Dakar? Is it Lagos in Nigeria? Or is it Kinshasa in DR Congo? Give you a few seconds to answer that. It should be appearing either in the sidebar or through your notifications at the top. Okay, let's see what we've got. Yes, so everyone that's with us has the right kind of idea here. Actually, depending on kind of where you get your data from, I've been using some from LSE cities. Kinshasa, so in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Dakar, Bangladesh, are currently in joint first place, growing at a rate of 50 people every hour. So those cities are expanding at a rate of 50 people every hour, according to some research a few years back. But again, currently, on current measures, Kinshasa is often ahead, taking over from Lagos a few years ago. So what does this mean? I mean, these kind of maps make us rethink perhaps the starting point for a lot of debates around cities and urbanization, and maybe encourage us to shift our thinking away from some of the kind of metropolises of the past kind of 30, 40, 50 years, right? Thinking from New York, from London, from Tokyo, to some of the kind of rapidly urbanizing cities of tomorrow, cities of the future. So in a sense, what I'm interested in the course that I teach is kind of what does it mean to start conversations about the future of cities, about the futures of urbanization from Kinshasa, from Kampala, from Lagos, rather than from New York, London, and Tokyo. How does that change the answer to some of the questions? Okay, next question. How many people do you think are predicted to be added to the urban African population by 2050? Publish this poll now. So in the next, 27 years, will there be estimates of 8 million, of 88 million, or 880 million people predicted to be added to the urban African populations, so African cities? Let's give you a few seconds to think about this one. And the result is, of course, 880 million, short of 1 billion people, right? So again, thinking about these kind of statistics and how they might shake some of the assumptions we bring with us into debates on cities and urbanization. Global urbanization, we based almost exclusively in Africa and Asia over the next 40 years, adding close to 2.5 billion people when you take the kind of predicted numbers from Asia into account as well to the urban African population. And by 2075, Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo is predicted to be the world's largest city. Right? So we're being encouraged, and I encourage us in class to think collectively about what it means to kind of flip the map, if you like, and think about the future of cities, but also the future of urban economy more broadly from Africa, right, from South Asia. And so one of the kind of provocations that come from this, and looking through images of places like Kinshasa, so this is a picture of what is predicted to become the largest city in the world by 2075, is here. This photo, I think, is interesting for illustrating also the kind of environmental dimensions of these processes, so the extent to which cities are rapidly encroaching on what we might understand to be agricultural and natural environments, right? And so one of the interesting trends in African cities in terms of livelihood and work is the massive increase in urban agriculture in the past 20, 30 years. So that is people living in cities, but surviving off agricultural production, often off very small plots of land, both for domestic consumption and for sale in large marketplaces. And here we can see, thinking about the value also of thinking across physical geography, the incursion of the city into the meander of a river. And so I talked about the importance of flipping the map. And Jenny Robinson, who we also think within this course, has really encouraged us also to kind of refresh the language that we use when describing urbanization, right? And so she argues that the reason why some of these kind of stereotypes, some of these kind of restrictive concepts and languages for describing urbanization, particularly in the global south, come so easily to us is because we've essentially been bombarded with them for a very long period of time, right? So from the starting point, we tend to frame cities in Africa as informal cities, as developing cities, even more historically as third world cities, right? And so Jenny Robinson argues that these categorizations essentially place limitations on our imagination, right? And she argues that rather than kind of continually using these categorizations that create these hierarchies, certain places being the originators of urbanization and other places simply being kind of developing or learning from London, Tokyo, New York, etc. She argues that we should think about a world of ordinary cities, which are all dynamic and diverse in different ways. So in a world of ordinary cities, ways of being urban and ways of making new kinds of urban futures are diverse and the product of the inventiveness of people in cities everywhere, which is a quote I really like, right? So rather than looking at people in markets in Kampala and kind of gazing upon them with kind of pity or with a kind of development lens, which kind of starts from a position of, okay, these people are in poverty, these people need to be helped, these people are deficient in some ways. The importance here is of kind of thinking about these places in ways that we can learn from, in ways that are inventive, in ways that are creative, in ways that are full of people who have agency in the ways that they're shaping and building their lives. And by the same token, we might increasingly think about work on the African continent as ordinary work, right? So rather than as being informal, as being unskilled, as being deficient in some ways. James Ferguson reminds us that actually across much of the world now, people lacking access both to land and wage employment form an increasingly prominent part of our reality. That is to say, it's not a particularly Asian or African challenge, the problem of kind of generating decent work in rapidly urbanizing cities. And increasingly wage employment, so the forms of work that are familiar to us in London, are the historical exception rather than the norm, right? And in particular, the rise in self-employment we're seeing now across the world. And according to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor in 2014, if we want to learn about entrepreneurship, we need to start not in Silicon Valley, not in California, not in China even, but in Uganda, which was declared the most entrepreneurial country in the world, right? And this is partly because the vast majority of people living in African cities make a living through self-employment, right? They are described by the ILO as own account workers, right? So business owners, self-employed workers, right? And what I think is really interesting here is that there's also another category of work that often we don't think about so much, we don't theorize so much in London, perhaps. That is the category of contributing family workers. So those are people essentially who are working for the enterprises or the businesses of their relatives. Right? And so if you take those two categories together, own account workers, so self-employed, and contributing family workers, you have virtually 3/4 of the entire workforce. So virtually 3/4 of the urban African labor force are either working in their own businesses or working in the business of a family member. So again, a bit like turning the map upside down, I'm really interested in thinking of kind of overturning conventional ways of thinking about work and economy, right? So when we start from this assumption that there's a labor market where we kind of get our CV, we brush it off, we get some qualifications and skills, and then we kind of sell our labor, that we take a job to the highest bidder or the best fit. There's an entirely different way of thinking about work and practicing work that's emerging in African cities, which is much more about your networks, skills acquired outside of formal education, the ability to work several jobs simultaneously, and things that are increasingly familiar also to our students, Queen Marian students in the UK more broadly. That is the kind of side hustle, right? The kind of activity of having a job alongside one's studies, alongside one's 9-to-5 job. So in a sense, I argue that there's much that can be learned from thinking about emerging patterns of work also from rapidly urbanizing African cities. So some questions which we need to start any kind of research project. So here's some kind of open questions that guide my research and guide the kind of discussions we have in this particular module. What does all this mean? Why should we care about these kind of statistics, these kind of trends, particularly in particular parts of East Africa? Well, we need to know, first of all, what are the social, political, environmental opportunities, as well as the challenges of rapid urbanization, right? So getting beyond the kind of the media headlines. How do people make a living in rapidly growing cities in the absence of formal employment opportunities? So what are the kind of creative, innovative, challenging, maybe sometimes exploitative conditions through which people make a living in the absence of 9-to-5 employment? And how might experiences of people living and working in different cities around the world challenge conventional theories of urbanization and development? What new possibilities might they bring into view? And at this point, it's probably worth going back to the photo from DR Congo to emphasize that kind of one of the key differences here when we think about this particular phase of urbanization is that when cities in the UK and North America, for example, urbanized 200, 300 years ago, it was hand in hand with an industrial revolution. So people were moving into cities as factories were being constructed in search of formal employment opportunities, with the idea that when that kind of industry was constructed, when the jobs were created, people were kind of slowly pulled into the city, jobs were created, and so-called informal settlements, or places where people were living on the outskirts of the city, slowly kind of became incorporated into the city fabric as people then had wages to construct their own houses, to move into council houses, to kind of construct their own life in a city. And what we're seeing now is an age of urbanization without industrialization. So the kind of long promised wave of industry arriving in cities like Kinshasa has kind of never arrived. And so it does raise a really important question about how people are then making a living in the absence of industrialization, or at least industrialization in the same way that we saw it in places like the UK. At the same time, there are really important questions for policymakers. So for those of you that are interested in working in policy, interested in sustainable development goals. So SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth is to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. And SDG 11 is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And there was a long process of lobbying, essentially, by urban researchers and activists to get an urban or a city-focused SDG on the agenda after the MDGs kind of omitted an explicit focus on cities 10, 15 years earlier. So again, these are really noble, we can argue, and I think be difficult to kind of oppose any of these goals, but they are kind of often difficult to both measure and to implement. So they raise a series of related questions. So, I mean, first of all, with the first one, how are we kind of defining what is decent work? Who gets to define what is decent work? How do we measure it? How do we know it when we see it? And how does it compare with the actually really existing forms of work that are emerging in rapid urbanizing cities like Kampala? How are these forms of work organized and regulated, right? So again, thinking about conventional forms of work, we assume that the trade union is the kind of main format of kind of negotiation, regulation, organization through workers can organize to increase their pay, increase their protections, increase their rights at work. So how do those kind of practices and processes take place in the absence of a formal trade union movement? What types of workplaces do they create? And then in relation to SDG 11, to what extent do these kind of divergent forms of work and economic activity enable or restrict the development of inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities? So to the answer to these questions, we'll take a short visual field trip, virtual field trip and a visual field trip, I should say, to Kampala, Uganda, which I argue is a really important place to be thinking about some of these questions. So Kampala is one of the fastest growing cities in sub-Saharan Africa. It also has one of the youngest populations in the world. So 77% of the population of Uganda is under the age of 30. So it's a really interesting place to think about these so-called crises of urbanization and employment, and this question of what people do when they arrive in rapidly urbanizing cities, right? 68% of the population make a living outside of the formal economy. So the vast majority, again, fall into these categories of own account worker or contributing family member, predominantly in the informal economy, which means essentially that they're activities that are not recognized, regulated, protected by the state. Right? And so I was in my kind of starting point for this project was to think about what are the kind of places and what are the kind of methods I can use to understand these questions. And so I work qualitatively. So I'm a qualitative researcher. And so I decided to use ethnography. So to kind of sit down in a particular place in a city for a year, if I could, to kind of get an apprenticeship to work alongside people in that particular place as a way of kind of understanding these questions by encountering them, by kind of situating myself within them, trying to kind of break down some of the kind of distance that emerges sometimes when we study these kind of phenomena just through statistics or through secondary data. So that was my first question. So what method should I use? The second question was, where should I use it? So what should my field site be? So I thought for a very long time about what is a kind of place that in some ways is symbolic or emblematic of these kind of broader processes. What are the places that are emerging or being transformed by these processes of rapid urbanization, by this kind of collective search for a living, for a livelihood? And at which point I decided to sit down in a marketplace. So this is the central market in Kampala, and a place that, as I say, is symbolic of the kind of changes that have taken places in cities like Kampala over the past 50 years. So it was constructed in the 1920s for a few hundred people, a few hundred spice and vegetable vendors. Population in 1964 was recorded as 381. And the infrastructure of the market remains exactly the same today as it did 50, 60 years ago. But the population of the market, that is the number of people that are now making a living in the market today, is over 10,000. So I was really interested in the ways in which the same infrastructure designed for a few hundred people had been entirely reinterpreted, redesigned, reappropriated in certain ways to enable a much larger group of people to make a living. So this raises the question of, how are people making a living in this market today? How are they getting alongside one another? How are they what are the kind of rules and regulations of the market for making a living in the absence of government regulation? How do people organize themselves and pay their bills essentially in this kind of space, right? And a space that, again, if you look at these kind of photos, can conjure imaginations of a kind of surplus population or a kind of dense urbanization associated with some of the dystopic and negative images that I mentioned at the beginning in kind of media representations of African cities. So I decided to sit down in this particular market. And I'm going to illustrate it now through some of my notes that I had during the course of doing my ethnography over a year between 2012 and 2014. I'm going to try and illustrate it in particular through the movements, the everyday kind of movements of a particular member of the market. But before I do that, my first task really when I arrived in Nakasero was to try and record all of the different ways in which people were making a living and the ways in which they described the things that they were doing. So I would kind of, working as an apprentice on a kind of fruit stall, I'd be asking people, what's your job, or how do you make a living, or what's kind of going on over there, or what's this person doing, et cetera, in order to kind of have a sense of the broad range of activities through which particularly new urban migrants in the city found themselves, made a living, found a place to live, et cetera. And I soon realized that this job was akin to kind of writing a dictionary, right? So no sooner as I'd come to a kind of a definitive list of activities, then other activities that I'd missed would be added, or somebody would say, no, that's not recycling, that's about procurement, that's not cleaning, that's about redistribution, that's not waste picking, that's about recycling, et cetera. So there are all kinds of different activities that I began to write down, and some of which, not all of which, conform to what we might understand to be kind of conventional understandings of work, or understandings of work that I brought with me when I arrived from the UK. So there were kind of activities where people would help somebody either move their goods around the market, to find a space to park, to introduce them to a potential customer, in ways that we might think about as a form of work or a favor, but which there was no kind of explicit economic payment attached to, right? There was no kind of explicit formal or informal contract attached to. So people were continually kind of engaged in activities that weren't associated with any payment, but came with the possibility of future remuneration, of future payment, right? So you're constantly developing relationships with the hope that those relationships, which have also been thought about as a kind of infrastructure, a social infrastructure, might deliver gains, possibilities, favors, payments in the future. So this kind of brings us to the hustle economy, right? And so rather than thinking about work from this kind of starting point, okay, skilled, unskilled, waged, unwaged, formal, in university, we now think about work in terms of graduate and non-graduate. The hustle economy, as it's been developed by my colleague Tatiana Thiem, kind of is a useful concept for bringing into focus alternative forms of work that she argues emerge through diverse forms of making do. And she argues that this word hustle, as she kind of uses it and as I use it in my work, is valuable for kind of revalorizing kind of activities that maybe have got a kind of semi-invisible or often devalued or even criminalized in certain contexts. So she says the hustle is valuable for kind of making visible activities that are kind of historically devalued and recognize them as meaningful social and economic experiments, right? So hustling combines the urgency of everyday economic survival with aspirational urban identities, right? Anchored in making the everyday meaningful and culturally significant. And this struck me because when I was asking people kind of what they were doing, rather than kind of dragging their feet and saying, oh, I'm just collecting some rubbish, I'm looking for this kind of work, or I need support with this. They would say, I'm hustling, I'm working, I'm growing my business, I'm an entrepreneur. So they would use this kind of very agentive language of an aspirational language of entrepreneurship, of business, of hustle, when they were describing activities that in many ways kind of fall outside of the ways in which we might have historically thought about those activities, particularly in the UK. So importantly, I thought hustling was really valuable as a kind of way of rethinking the relationship between urbanization and work, but also between youth and work in contexts of resource scarcity. That comes from Thiem's work. So enough of the kind of theory. I'll now try and illustrate this, as I said, by following a particular member of the market around on a market day. So I did a number of apprenticeships while I was there doing my ethnography. And one of the days I followed around a young man called Alex, who we might understand as a waste picker, but he wouldn't have used that language himself. His job, he said, was to organize and manage kind of resources and infrastructures in the market. So I followed him around on an average day in order to kind of really try and understand, okay, what is the actual, what are the kind of everyday activities through which people make a living and through the market is kind of organized and reconstituted. So I'm going to read from my notes here to keep some of the kind of detail in the description when it comes to Alex's life. Yeah. So Alex is 23 years old, and he's been working in the market for around 3 years, working as a waste collector, those are my words, as I said, in an area of the market that is referred to as the ghetto. He arrived in Kampala as an orphan without a secondary school qualifications or the contacts or money necessary to enter more profitable areas of the market. Right? And in that sense, Alex is a representative of thousands of other people that arrive in cities like Kampala every day in search of a livelihood. And so rather than trying to situate his life within a predefined category, right, as poor, as uneducated, or as unskilled, as unemployed, as an informal worker, etc., I was really interested in understanding it on its own terms. So what are the kind of ways in which he describes what he's doing? And in order, therefore, to understand the role of the market as well on its own terms. So I did this over the course of the market day, in which Alex makes this continual movement around the market. So I noticed that he made this movement around the market several times over the day. So I kind of accompanied for one of these kind of circles. So Alex wakes up every day on the corner of the market, on the veranda of a hardware shop. And he is woken by Frank Matovu, who's the owner of the shop, who greets him before opening his business. Frank and Alex are the same age. However, Frank is a university graduate and he's responsible for one of his mother's several shops in the market, including handling phone calls to suppliers of tools and appliances from China and Dubai. So Frank would be defined by the ILO in the pie chart I showed earlier as a contributing family member. This shop veranda offers Alex a space of relative shelter and safety that's difficult to find in other areas of the city. And Frank is happy to provide this for Alex in return for what he describes as his security or his eyes on the street. So he kind of protects his shop at night. Frank describes Alex as a low earner in the market, right? So it's important. He doesn't describe him as being poor. He describes him as being as a low earner. And by using that language, he says quickly that high earners like me have a responsibility to support low earners like Alex, right? So there's a kind of there's a kind of system of social assistance or redistribution that many members of the market invoke through these kind of language of low earners and high earners. After waking up, Alex crosses the road to the ghetto, which is the entry point into the market with men with only their bare lives and willingness to engage in challenging forms of labor. New arrivals to this particular area of the market buy their entry through the offer of gifts, which are then shared out among the group. So after initially being chased away from the market, right, so the borders of the market and these kind of spaces are often highly competitive. So there's a real challenge of how you gain entry, particularly if you're a newcomer, if you've just kind of moved to the city. So Alex kind of secured his entry through the offer of gifts, through cigarettes, in the first instance, which were then shared out among other members of the group. After a couple of hours of chatting, he begins work. He leaves the ghetto and walks through to the Kabengo, which is a small area of the market inhabited by a younger group of men who arrive with small amounts of money, with which they were able to purchase single sacks of produce that they sell from the floor over the course of the market day. New arrivals into this area of the market place their bags or their produce on the floor, and then try to enter the market, to enter more centrally into the market by exchanging favors and developing relationships with their neighbors. Right? So when you first enter, you put your produce on the side of the road, you're very susceptible to having it confiscated by the city council or by the police when they're kind of enforcing the boundaries of the market in the city. And also you're less likely to get good customers on the outskirts. So people kind of slowly move in to the market through developing relationships, for example, by watching someone stall while they're away or while they're sick or while they're with family up country. So in a sense, the physical organization of the marketplace and the infrastructure of the market is constructed on social relationships and on favors, right? Rather than being kind of gazetted spots that you kind of procure through a conventional market economy, right? So you go to the market offices and you look for a rent. These kind of spaces were negotiated and the product of kind of everyday negotiation and jostling. So again, a very different way of thinking about infrastructure and thinking about the space of the market. So Alex moves through this area of the market and engages in bets and arguments relating to English Premier League football matches and American boxing that took place over the weekend. He then continues towards the upper stalls. The upper stalls are one of the oldest areas of the market, and they're predominantly populated by female Kenyan vendors who sell imported fruit and vegetables from as far as Egypt and South Africa. As Alex arrives here, he greets Margaret, a young female vendor at the end of the row. He then starts cleaning the ditch behind her stall, dividing the produce between that which is spoiled and must go to the dump and that which is salvageable and can be resold from other areas of the market, right? So again, even this language of kind of waste picking, of cleaning, didn't quite describe what he was doing. He was very much sorting and kind of reorganizing products and produce in the market, moving produce from this place into another place, into a place where it was seen to have more efficacy or more value. And people often describe the market, as I mentioned at the beginning, with reference to different kind of notions of social and spatial hierarchy. They distinguish between first and second class produce. So first class apples, shiny, waxed, kind of imported apples. Second class apples, ones that are maybe spoiled or kind of the equivalent of the kind of yellow sticker in Tesco, maybe very close to their end date. And at the same time, they distinguish between high and low earners. There's an understanding that kind of first class produce is sold by high earners in these kind of gazetted areas of the market, and second class produce is sold by low earners in some of the open areas of the market. And one of Alex's roles is essentially to reorganize the kind of fruit and veg around the market into these kind of categories, into these different spaces. In return for this work, Monica pays Alex around 500 shillings, so it's about 15 to 20 pence. But I should say that he does this kind of several times a day. In addition to this payment, she also provides him with additional forms of support whenever they're needed. For example, when he needs money for a burial, when he needs money for sickness, so for hospital fees, which is all private in Uganda, or for hospital fees for one of his family members, or occasionally when he's arrested by the Ugandan police, which still enforce a colonial vagrancy law that prevents people without an explicit economic activity, so without a job as defined by the police, from being present in the city, particularly at night, which was a kind of racialized law that was imposed by the British colonial administration, still in place today. So after doing this kind of first trip and engaging with kind of conversations with different people in the market, Alex makes his first trip back to the ghetto and to the rubbish dump, carrying one sack of rubbish and one of second-class produce that can be resold by the side of the road, which you can kind of see in this image here. At the end of one market day, Alex makes around 8,000 shillings, around £2.50. which would put him above the kind of UN and World Bank poverty lines quite comfortably, but in no means provides access to a luxurious life in Kampala, right? It's not enough, for example, to secure him secure residency or a flat or a rent on a property. Hence, he's kind of still staying in the market at night. However, rather than keeping this money on him, he spends some on food and drink and then keeps the rest with a money lender in the market who holds his savings for another day. And at the end of the year, he then takes that back to his family up country. So over the course of the one market day, Alex is involved in a range of different kind of interactions and exchanges with all kinds of different people in the market, generating these kind of compositions or these infrastructures across a range of different capacities and needs. So I think one interesting thing that becomes instantly kind of apparent in these kind of places is the huge diversity of people that are present in it. So from Frank, who's on the phone, to suppliers in China and Dubai, supplying electronics, to Alex, who's moving kind of small packets of produce around the market, and to people in the foreground here who's selling often very small numbers of produce from mats on the floor on the outskirts of the market, right? And so in a sense, the market, what organizes the market is these kind of sense of hierarchy, different people and different products in different places, but critically, it's a system of kind of redistribution and reallocation that come with these kind of different categories. So this idea that low earners such Alex are supported by high earners such as Frank and Monica, both through immediate payments, but also through other kinds of exchanges and favors as and when Alex needs them. So at the end of this day, I kind of asked Alex how he'd describe his role in the market, right? I was eager to avoid asking what his job was or to kind of use a language of work. And I wanted really him to describe it in his own terms. So he used the Luganda word okukola, which means to work, right? But I went back to my kind of Luganda dictionary and was thinking about the fact that there wasn't just one translation, a direct translation of this word. It had all kinds of different meanings. So okukola means to work, but it also means to make, to do, to construct, to execute, to perform, to toil, and to mend, right? So I thought there was, going back to the kind of idea of the hustle, of this kind of activity of inventive, where a job doesn't exist, there's this kind of practice of creatively inventing one or creatively inserting yourself into a marketplace, into an economy, in order to secure a livelihood. There is that kind of creative emphasis that comes through this word in Luganda, but also an emphasis on mending, which I thought was really interesting, in a sense that you might understand his work as one of physically kind of repairing, reorganizing, recycling within the market. And in cities like Kampala, one of the fastest growing kind of economies is the repair economy, right? So it's very easy to get things repaired in ways that's often frustratingly difficult in so-called advanced economies such as the UK. By the same token, people are reluctant to describe the market as a workplace, right, in the ways that we might imagine it when we're thinking about livelihoods in the UK. Instead, when I asked people what they thought about the market, they described it as a school, a garden, and a pharmacy for the common woman, man and woman, right? So a school insofar as it was seen to provide a business apprenticeship for people who were unable to afford private education. A garden insofar as it provided very cheap access to food, right? So you could come to the market, and often one of the favors that people would be requesting is kind of free produce at the end of the day when people were closing down. So somewhere you could get food if you were a new arrival in the city, you didn't have any money. And also a pharmacy insofar as there were a whole range of herbal remedies and people who are specialized in kind of providing advice on how these should be applied in order to cure kind of everyday ailments. And critically, I really like this quote that another participant, Edward, kind of provided. He said, well, markets are important for building society. This isn't just kind of a workplace. People come from all over the country and learn to lose their bad habits and to be in one line, to have a good heart and to help others. So really a kind of imagination of the marketplace, not as a hyper-competitive, kind of capitalistic, entrepreneurial space, but as a kind of social institution, right? As a place where there are all kinds of channels of support and also modes of kind of socialization, right? So kind of teaching people to behave in certain ways. And if you behave in certain ways, you're then eligible for certain forms of work and certain forms of redistribution when you find yourself in a difficult spot. So when we zoom out, kind of what is the kind of broader point here? What can we learn from places like Nakasero? What can we learn from the activities of people like Alex. Well, we know that Alex is not alone. So in the world, there are currently estimated to be around 20 million people, predominantly again in African, Asian, and Latin American cities, who make a living through waste picking, which I should emphasize is not how Alex described his work, but it is how certain researchers and certainly government institutions would describe his work. So there's about 20 million people earning a living in a similar way. And critically, when we kind of zoom out and we think about the contribution of these people in the collective, they provide reusable materials to other enterprises. And in many cases, they provide kind of direct forms of economic input to what we might understand to be formal businesses. So not only do they enable the kind of reorganization, the clearing, the recycling of spaces like markets, right? They also provide direct economic inputs to formal businesses, such as Frank's. And critically, all kinds of other people then benefit from waste pickers' work in this way. Secondly, there's a range of kind of environmental impacts that have also been noted by institutions like WeGo. So by gathering garbage from public spaces, waste pickers contribute to cleanliness and help beautify the city. They also divert a significant quantity of materials from the waste stream. So one study found that more than 80,000 people were responsible for recycling about 3 million tons of waste per year across 6 cities in Africa. Which takes us back to these kind of starting questions and some of the kind of dystopic and negative imaginations of rapid urbanization, particularly in relation to climate change, right? So often you'll see kind of reference to these kind of rapidly growing cities, particularly in Africa and Asia, as being emblematic of the huge problems and challenges of climate change. To which social scientists and activists and people working in cities like Kampala often respond, well, it entirely depends on how people are consuming, how they're recycling, how kind of uses of resources and carbon critically emerge and evolve in these kind of cities, right? And we know that to date, carbon emissions in Africa and particularly in South Asia are some of the lowest in the world, right? So in a sense, it's the work of waste pickers and the kind of growing repair economies in African cities in particular. They may give us pause for thought. And rather than kind of being kind of part of a dystopian narrative of urbanization, they can kind of help shift that narrative and create kind of ways in which people in London, for example, can rethink the role of waste, rethink the role of recycling, rethink the role of climate and environment in our own kind of urban planning in our own cities. So this kind of reuse and recycling also kind of critically decreases the amount of virgin material needed for production, conserving natural resources, while also reducing air and water pollution. But at the same time, we should be realistic about some of the challenges that Alex and his colleagues face. So waste picking, depending on the type of waste that's been collected, can be dangerous, particularly in kind of large electronics dumps in West Africa in particular. There's often an absence of government recognition and protection. Hence a reliance on the kinds of social networks that I described in the talk. And they can be poorly paid relative to other jobs. So $2.50 may put you above the World Bank's poverty line, but in the context of Kampala, it still leads to a very challenging kind of existence on a day-to-day basis. And in this kind of context, all kinds of organizations of kind of campaigning for increased recognition, protection, and pay for waste pickers, including Women in Formal Employment Globalizing and Organizing, which was a South African organization that I mentioned on the previous slide. If you're interested in these kind of case studies, do have a look at their website. They have all kinds of publications focused on waste pickers, as well as domestic workers and other categories of so-called informal work. And rather than eradicating this work, they're really arguing for improvement, recognition, and protection of workers such as Alex. So what does this mean for the UK? Right, another question that I got asked kind of on my return from Kampala. Right? What is the relevance? What are the connections between what's going on in this market in Nakasero and what's happening in the UK? Well, more than we might expect. So the fastest growing labour market activity in the UK is currently part-time self-employment, right, which grew between 88% between 2001 and 2015. That's people essentially who are working, who are self-employed, but are not working full-time. So often, in a sense, the side job, right, or the side hustle, or the online business, or the part-time job in the gig economy, working for Deliveroo and related organizations. At the same time, the kind of figures that we receive on the news about employment in the UK, right, principal among which is the unemployment rate, is increasingly deceptive, right, or increasingly tells us less and less about the realities of work in the UK. So the fact that it's often cited as being historically low, so 3.7% unemployment rate, conceals the fact that in the UK at the moment, somebody just has to work 1 hour a week, right, for delivery, for example, to Uber, or to be classified as being in employment. So if you work 1 hour a week for Deliveroo, you're taken off the unemployed list in the government statistics, and you become classified as employed. And at the same time, whereas historically this kind of model of full-time wage work was understood to provide a good source of living, right? This is the kind of social contract that if you work, you kind of can support yourself, you can live in relative comfort. The majority of those in poverty in the UK are currently in work or working, residing in working families, right? So this idea of poverty being the cause of unemployment or the absence of work is no longer the case in the UK, as it's not the case in Uganda. Instead, everybody is incredibly busy, working often multiple jobs, multiple hours, in an attempt to kind of get themselves above the poverty line, in an attempt to build meaningful lives for themselves and their families. And if we zoom out kind of one more level and think about what Nakasero has to teach the world, and thinking about geographers, development practitioners, environmental scientists more broadly, well, they tell us about changing patterns of work. So the emphasis on what's termed occupational straddling, so having more than one job, we now know is a global phenomenon. The emphasis on improvisation and experimentation, right? Increasingly, these are things that graduates are kind of, particularly experimentation, creativity, are being told are useful for kind of standing out from the crowd when they go into job application processes. An emphasis on skills acquired outside of formal education. So I talked about the market being described as a kind of school. By the same token, people in all kind of corners of the world increasingly are being expected to acquire so-called soft skills and other types of skills in order to navigate the changing world of work. Increasing reliant also on kin and social relations. So I mentioned the kind of role of social relations, family ties in the market. By the same token, these kind of relations are increasingly important for navigating economies globally around the world, and an emphasis on reciprocation and redistribution. So what does all this add up to? What does it mean? Well, it challenges a lot of our historical understandings of work, right? So it blurs this kind of neat distinction that we have going back to the Industrial Revolution between work time or productive time and leisure time or unproductive time, right? Increasingly, these things are all blurred, right? We're emailing while we're on the train, on our phones, where our leisure time is invaded by work. Our work time sometimes involves kind of intense social connections, right, as I mentioned in the market. And increasingly, there's a blurring of work and life at the same time. So thanks so much for bearing with me during all of that. In conclusion, I argue that in this talk, and I argue in the course on urban African economies, that some of the language we use to describe people's places and activities, particularly in the global south, conceals more than it reveals about these people in these places, right? So in a sense, the starting point, going back to this idea of thinking about cities as ordinary rather than developed, undeveloped, productive, unproductive, formal, informal, thinking about them as ordinary kind of levels the playing field and enables us to have a conversation through which we can learn from places in other regions of the world, right? It provides a platform for people from these places, people working in places like Nakasero, also to represent themselves in their own terms, rather than be defined by a language of developmentalism, right? Secondly, that seeing cities like Kampala and Kinshasa as ordinary cities helps us kind of understand these complexities, right? And also see some of the connections as well as the disconnections between life in London, for example, and life in Kampala. It brings into focus some of the opportunities as well as the challenges of rapid urbanization, right? So I mentioned a moment ago this kind of challenge of carbon. I have this extra slide here that I just bring up now to illustrate this final point, that these kind of, particularly this emphasis on recycling, on reuse, on upcycling, on kind of the reuse and reorganization of materials, these kind of bring into question the extent to which the model of urbanization that's happening in places like Kampala is going to replicate the really carbon intensive models of urbanization that we witnessed in the global north over the past 200 years. And then finally, it encourages to think about the ways in which cities and societies in the UK may learn from, as well as continue to kind of support and work with peoples in other regions of the world. So thank you very much for your attention. And I think we now have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has one. To kind of do work and do research alongside members of staff. And often those can then open up opportunities just like the ones that were open to me through working with researchers in Germany on questions of work and SDG 8. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much for your time and your attention. Do get in touch. My email's on my profile here, but also on the school website. If you have any follow-up questions about this particular module or about kind of studying questions of development and human geography more broadly at Queen Mary, I'd be really happy to answer any questions you have.